right, so hello everyone. Now, that's foggy over here. Not as foggy as I thought it would be, but that's okay. So I have to be honest, I don't like cats. I really don't like cats. But I will have to explain why we have so many cats. It's been a long, long journey, and there are reasons for it. Now, first of all, how many of you actually like cats? Who doesn't like cats? Who is a dog person instead? So according to my scientific survey, approximately 60% of people are dog people, and 30% are cat people, and everybody else just doesn't care. Well, it's too late for us, but you still will see where I'm heading with this. Now, that's really is foggy. Now, today I want to basically share some of the things we learned along the journey of actually moving from one thing to the next thing, kind of redesigning the Smashing magazine. It was a big, big deal for us. It was a big journey. And I was listening to Frank's talk today in the morning, and I felt like, yeah, tried that, check mark, tried that, check mark. That sentence where webpack, npm, whatever, all of the stuff, yeah, did that. Spent a lot of time on weekends doing that. So it was no fun, but we actually learned a lot along the way. And this is my point. I want to kind of convey some things that we learned along the way. Now, I have to warn you, tighten up your seatbelt. This is going to be a journey. We have 360 slides to go. Ready? Go. All right. So that's me, that's not so important. This is important because this is a website that we've been working on, right? And it's being redesigned, and it's actually almost finished. It's just a matter of weeks now, at latest month, hopefully. And it's going to become this. And if you don't like red, which you probably don't, this is going to be white as well. We'll find out how. Now, today I want to talk basically about 4 different sections, or 4 different things. I want to look into the design part of it. I want to look into the front-end side of things, including performance and stuff, and then backend, and then also some of the things we still have to do. We have like still over 100 bugs to fix, and then not necessarily not critical. So let's dive into design, and first, kind of want to go back a little bit and think about the way we approach design and the things that were important to us when we actually started working on it. And don't get me wrong, it's not like a show-off thing or so. I just want to share kind of some of the things and thoughts that we've been collecting and having throughout this time. Right? And of course, first, I do want to think about and talk about, at this point, about visual design. And, at the beginning, it was like the project started like 2016, somewhere early 2016. And we had to think about what the Smashing experience would be and what would it be like. And one of the things that were kind of important for me personally is to embed some sort of personality that would make the website stand out somehow. Right? Of course, it's all about articles, it's all about reading experience, but we wanted to have an identity that would be different from necessarily from something else that would be more generic, right? So it had to be a bit more specific, a bit more interesting. And I think there is a real problem that we all kind of covered today, right? When it comes to design, web design, because the design process is weird and complicated, because it involves people and systems which often are weird and complicated, because many of the organizations or many of the companies that we are working in tend to be quite complex. They're not just 2, 3 people, they're more like 5, 7, 15, 25 people, and that also requires a lot of management, requires a lot of thinking, processes, and so on and so forth. So things get complicated, right? Now, many managers tend to think that this is a creative process, where you start somewhere, right, at some point, come on, here, you start somewhere and go, and you iterate and iterate and iterate and iterate until you hit the finish point at some point, right? But this is so wrong on so many levels, because actually the creative process, whether you're a designer or developer, is much more like this, where you start somewhere and go, and you explore all kind of different options, just to figure out what are you supposed to do next, right? And at some point, you might be hitting this dead end right here, right, where you just don't know how to recover from it. And this is where we're losing time, right? This is where we're losing a lot of time because we have to recover from it and move somewhere else, right? Now that, to me at least, explains this, right? Some of you might have seen this before. Which one of these 2 possible websites are you currently designing today? The one on the left or the one on the right? Because there is nothing else on the web. That's it. You have the one on the left, the one on the right. The only difference sometimes is the placement of a carousel, which might be on the top or on the bottom, but everything else is kind of the same. Now, it's not because we're lazy. Right? I look at you, we're smart cookies here in the room, right? We know how to build good stuff, but we don't have time. We have to rely on things that used to work in the past, right, in order to make progress. So maybe, just maybe, very often we end up really pushing pixels one by one. Like, how many of you had this conversation in the past? Should we have like border radius 11 pixels or 10? 9, 12, and then reverse it back to 9, like 2 months later, right? Maybe it doesn't matter. So for me, it was really about kind of looking at the big picture of things. Maybe we should do something else different, right? And again, the reason for why this happens is because we stick to the rules, right? We stick to these good old principles. And don't get me wrong, I like rules. Germany, right? I like rules, but I also like to break the rules. And I think we should be breaking rules more often than we do. Because, everybody tells us what to do and what not to do, right? We should not define the line height in pixels, because that's not cool, right? We all know that. So we don't do that, right? You should not base the breakpoints on device sizes, right? We shouldn't do that. That's not cool, right? You should not take the name of the Lord performance in vain, right? You should not do that. That's not cool, right? And so we tend to rely on things that used to work in the past because, they're best practices. And I respect best practices, but we need to find that thing that defines our personality too. Because otherwise, it's all blunt. So you have a new project, and you have content and navigation to organize, right? So you put it in on a nice, beautiful desktop screen, and then somebody comes to you and tells you, no. You should not start desktop first. That's not how things work these days. We should prioritize and focus and start mobile first, right? So you say, all right, so I'm going to change the canvas a little bit, and I'm going to put that navigation in a fancy, magical spot, that magical, universal spot that stands for navigation. So you're going to use the Hamburg icon, obviously, but then somebody comes to you and says, no. That's not cool. You don't put important stuff behind the Hamburg icon. You should show it. If something is important, just show it, right? Then you say, okay, I'm going to display that navigation, right? I still have this content to organize, so it's going to go under the navigation, right? And then you find out, well, don't put important stuff below the fold. And you end up saying, oh, I know a fantastic pattern that everybody is using these days. It's great, it's going to be magic, and I can keep the content above the fold. And then somebody says, no. That's not how things work. You're not supposed to use carousel. So welcome to Creative Process 2017, right? So I asked myself, now, what does it mean for us? And we want to respect and embrace best practices, but we also want to kind of find a way to break them. And I was very inspired by a couple of examples I found where I thought, maybe it has something that's really, really valuable and interesting. So just a month ago, or 2 months ago actually, I attended a conference in Denmark, and this guy, a young designer called Morgan Smuller, came on stage and said a couple of things that stuck with me for quite some time. Because I was desperately looking for a framework to embed personality in our design. And I was thinking about something similar like a while back, 2 years ago, right? But this really hit the point. It was really that point where it made all sense. He said, if we want to stand out today, because everybody is pretty decent and great these days, to outperform our competitors, we need to delight customers with a remarkable design and a unique, charming personality. Now, that's what everybody says anyway. And when I hear about unprecedented attention to detail, I hear expensive, right? So I wasn't sure, but then he continued, we should underpromise and overdeliver. Capture attention and guide it skillfully. On the web today, it all boils down to one single thing, outstanding storytelling for great art direction. Now, we don't think about art direction being an interface thing most of the time. When I think about storytelling, I think about this, or this, but definitely, oh, okay, maybe this, right? But definitely, the monkey. Oh.
I'm here, I was waiting for
Okay, that's, all right. Just for you, Frank, right? More is coming. But I don't think about this being a storytelling. And I have no connection at all to Uber. If there was a service that was like 5 cents cheaper on average, I would just jump right away. I don't have any connection to Uber at all. I mean, no emotional connection at least. But I have a very strong emotional connection to MailChimp. Somebody has to give me money, so I move away from MailChimp, right? And I'm wondering why. I ask myself, why is that? And I really ask this question, so maybe there's something magical about that brand that makes it work. And don't get me wrong, it's not just the chimp, right? It's not just the mascot and things. But it's maybe a character personality embedded in it. Because as a part of their thing, they also create these children books, which are colored books, right? They just distribute everywhere. There is no like magical button saying buy MailChimp or what it even does. It's just nice and friendly and personal. Like, I love eating bananas for breakfast. Now, I love eating bananas for breakfast too. Here's my connection, right there, right? And that's amazing. And it keeps going, by the way, the spaceship. right? Okay, only you get that. I will stop now. Right? And so it keeps going and going. It's very nice, and I'm not stupid. Of course it's marketing, but I would love to have this kind of marketing. I think it's really, really powerful, and it's wonderful. So I've been coming back to this a lot, and what I want to show you are a couple of examples, just before we continue, to kind of inspire you maybe, even if I actually want to do a bit more about the smashing itself, because I think it's more important. So I want to tell the story about Tijuana Flats, which is a network. I have no idea how much I'm doing on time, how well I'm doing on time. I can just go for hours, just so you know. So Tijuana Flats is a chain of Mexican restaurants in the US, and this is what they look like inside. Right? You might like it, you might hate it, it doesn't matter, but they do have a unique style and personality and a voice that they're speaking, right? And these walls are pretty, large, so the ceilings are pretty high. And so, I mean, really high. Look at the people there. They are really, really tall ceilings, right, and stuff. So every 3-4 months or so, they would hire professional graffiti artists to come and repaint, to renew and refresh their identity, right? And obviously, their menu has to reflect it somehow, right? So again, you might like it, you might hate it, but it's kind of placed nicely, and so should their website. That's their website, right? I don't know if you like it or hate it, probably both at the same time, right? But it's kind of placed nicely with their identity. Now, let me ask you something. How would you actually build all of this? Carousel, business, right? And so they decided to make a big move. And in the spirit of best practices, performance, flat design, and everything that we all respect and embrace, they moved away from this to this. Right? And I feel like despite the fact that they removed all the carousels, removed all the parallax effects, removed all the things that we hate, honestly speaking, right? There's a lot of stuff lost between this design and this design, right? And this is why I think we see this stuff happening, right? Bloomberg and Spotify and recently Dropbox doing some sort of brutalist design, right? Kind of really weird color schemes, really weird interaction design. It's like you go and think, this is just madness, right? So when was the last time you used marquee tag?
Yesterday.
Yesterday? Good for you. Maybe we should use it more, or maybe not. But it's interesting to see this happening, right? You might think this is just horrible. Well, this is a design conference website, right? They sold out within 6 days. You might hate the design, but it's a good design because it served its purpose, right? And in fact, Bloomberg is doing a lot of stuff in this direction. Most recently, like one of these 50 companies to watch 2017, right? Which is just weird on so many levels, because they basically wanted to find out who they are. They were not any different from MSNBC or all the others. They wanted to kind of rediscover their identity. So they hired a bunch of designers who were given the freedom to do whatever they wanted. And oh yeah, they went all the way and did whatever they wanted, right? And the thing that they actually created just recently was this feature on Elon Musk. Oh, I have to start playing. Which is out of this world. I mean, you will have to remember this day and this time today. You will not be able to unsee it. This is so strange on so many levels. And according to, at least they tweeted that this is like the heaviest visited page they had this year, right? So I don't think that you would design it, but it can serve as an inspiration of what you can do if you don't, but you don't have to go that way, like going all the way to break things, right? And so what do we do then? Well, maybe we can kind of wrap a story around things. That's sometimes enough. And it's not the talk about the worst design in the world or so, but it's really interesting to see how you can wrap a story about everything, around everything, and then sell your product. So this is Hans Brinker Hotel in Amsterdam. Now, it's not a good hotel, right? It's a problem if you're not a good hotel, right? You don't sell enough rooms. So they decided to redesign in a way. So there were two options, either investing in the hotel by making it better, or kind of make it look better, or just shut down, right? Now for them, both options were not real options, right? So they hired a designer who said, well, you know what? If we can't be the best hotel in the world, what if we try to be the worst hotel in the world? What if we sell the worst hotel experience as an experience? Now guess what? They're expanding to Lisbon now, so you can have your most horrible hotel experience as well, because they're booked all the way in advance, right? It's like even if you have a bad hotel, you can still make a story around it and sell it. And we all talk about pop-ups being annoying and horrible and disgusting. This is the most annoying and the most delightful pop-up I've seen in my life. I would love every single website to have it. Right? And it's not about like making these big steps and trying to break things and stuff like this. Sometimes it's just enough attention to one little thing. Like look at the little tiny title select dropdown that everybody probably hates or doesn't like at least, right? So you could just make it Mr. and Mrs. and whatever, or you could go all the way. Because why not, right? Maybe you'd like to be a princess today, or maybe you'd like to be a lord, a lieutenant commander, right? You can go all the way. Now imagine if you discover something like this by accident, this will literally make your day, right? So, I mean, I know these are all crazy examples, but you don't have to go that way, right? So this guy decided to just split himself into 3 parts, and that's his identity and signature, right? So every time you refresh, it appears randomly, more or less, but that's okay. It's not difficult to implement it. It's not as hard as the previous one, right? So at least he has his own identity and his own signature. Here, the only thing that makes this website, different from everything else is just the use of animation, right? If you remove all the animations, especially the silky smooth thing in the middle, right? It's just like every other portfolio on the planet, right? So for us, it was about finding that one thing and boost it up and use it consistently everywhere, right? And so we got to work. We had to start from scratch working on this little thing, which was an undertaking, right? We had to create a tool that would accommodate everything for articles, for the magazine, for the shop, for a job board, for membership, and we had to do it all from scratch because in the past, all our experiences were very fragmented. We were using WordPress for the magazine, we were using a Ruby-based, a custom Ruby-based system for job board, we're using Shopify for the shop, right? And of course, if you buy a job board, you would need to register again in the shop and also register again for conference tickets, for example. We wanted to have a unified experience and more specifically promote the new product that was kind of becoming the main thing for us. But of course, it all starts with a problem, right? And the problem in our case was, of course, ad blockers. Now, don't get me wrong. I use ad blockers, and I encourage everybody here to use an ad blocker, right? Because I don't believe in advertising anyway. It's a long story. We'll talk about it later. But I mean, most of you are using ad blockers, right? Well, that's perfectly fine. Well, I'm using it too, right? But it was a big problem for us. And specifically, it wasn't just ad blocking. It was actually advertising. Because pretty much every year, consistently, we were losing 50% of our revenue. Like every year, consistently. So it meant that after 5 years after the last relaunch, we are now at the 1/16th in terms of revenue of what we used to be 5 years ago. And on our site, right now, over 66% of readers are actually using ad blockers. So we had to find a way to make it better. And for us, this new product that we're introducing, the membership, was it, right? But we had to find a place to prominently integrate it into everything else. So we got to work. So we started working with Dan Moll, and Sarah was actually the lead front-end developer. And before that, we also have been working with Andrew Clark, and we've been also working with Ilya. And I'm showing these names because I think they're important. And very often, these people stay behind the scenes. I'm here presenting, but they are doing the hard work, right? And our poor cat illustrator, he dreams in cats now. Poor guy. Because we have tons of cats, as you will see in a second, right? And also backend, Netlify guys, animation, Sarah Dresner, accessibility, Hayden, marketing, Paul Borg, and Joey Lish. And many people made this happen. And we started, at least I started, with text first. And I know that that's not something that many people start with, but for me it was kind of important to look into what would make the experience from the contextual standpoint, from a copywriting standpoint. So I sat down and I started writing text, like lots of text, markdown files, like tons of them, just to figure out what would be the language that we'll be using to communicate, right? And we were using this kind of stuff, just simple markdown file. And then my gateway to really understand what the personality is going to be like was error messages. I basically started writing error messages first, because once you pick up a customer who is annoyed by a bug or a mistake or something else, and turn it into a smile, that's when you actually got that customer, when he or she will become loyal and kind of create some kind of emotion. So this is what's my thinking. And of course, it's like all testing stuff, and it has changed a little bit over time, But if you get a message on first name, and it says, well, we're missing your first name, that's different than when you say, well, you know, no cat is an island because you have many cats on the site, so you probably have a name. That's a very different voice and tone that you're playing here. And once we had that, we could also play how the visual design would be, you know, would turn out. And once we had kind of some understanding about what that persona of the magazine would be, we started looking into typefaces. And typeface choice was a really big deal for me. It was a very difficult thing for me. We ended up with Elena, and we ended up with Media for headings. I can't stand that typeface. Now look at the A. Just look at the A, right? But I had to ask myself, so what is the point of the entire thing? What is the point of the redesign? You know, when we started asking users and customers, and you know, people like you, what do you think about smashing? They would not say things like professional, respected, reliable, things like that, which I kind of always connected with the magazine. They would say things like funky, personal, friendly, and they would say cats. And I never got it. Why cats? I never wanted my legacy to be cats. That would be sad. Well, at least a little bit sad, right? But there was a good reason for it. Well, one of our most prominent products is the conference, Smashing Conference, and we have these damn cats following us everywhere. It doesn't matter where you look, you will always find a cat picking somewhere, right? Even, you know, in the dark places, or we're going all the way. So we said, okay, so what do we do? Do we try to make it, you know, strong and professional and respectable, or do we embrace how people see us, right? So I said, okay, I don't like cats, but that's okay. That's not a big problem, so let's have cats. In fact, if we do have cats, let's have many, 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 many cats, right? But it was not just about cats, obviously. It was also about finding the right angle. And I actually mean it, because we really had to find the right angle. When we started playing, we had all kind of funky layouts in mind. Maybe we could do something like this. Maybe we could have vertical headings. But very quickly, I mean, coming back to the question of signature personality, we had to find out what would be our signature. And it has become the tilting of the logo, right? From day 367, I think, when we did the first actual smashing logo, it always has been tilted by 10.6 degrees. Now, we did a big redesign, moving from 10.6 to 11 degrees. Now, that was a big deal for me, trust me. It was a very big deal for me, right? But I thought maybe this thing, the tilting, could become the signature of everything else. So one of the first mock-ups looked like this, where we have, I mean, you can hardly see it, but there is an avatar on the left upper corner, which is kind of tilted. And then we started playing and playing and playing and created the living style guide. And, you know, as you can see, many elements here are tilted. This was kind of the first idea of what we could do. And then when Dan Moll came on the project, we started looking into maybe we can actually, you know, use this idea on a more global scale. So this is we could do the same thing for drop caps, for avatars, kind of explaining why we do this and what's the point of it, kind of trying to play and play and play and play and play, and then using kind of also looking into interaction design. And over time, it has evolved and evolved and evolved, and it was always the tilting. It was everywhere. And in the end, we ended up with this, right? And I know that many people will hate it. It's not like I don't care. That would be very mean. But I kind of don't care. And there is a good reason, because I think that there is something that we need to change. If we do everything that we're supposed to do, then nothing will change. But maybe it's time to change some things. For me, it's very, very important to dedicate so much space on the top. Come back, right? To dedicate so much space on the top to the author. There are often a byline, often in gray color, somewhere at the bottom of the article, or maybe at the top of the article if you're happy, right? I think it's better to give them too much space than too little attention, right? So I think that it's okay if we have to scroll past, but you see that person, because without that person, that article wouldn't exist. And so another thing that we also did for tilting is, you know, go all the way, right? Either not do something or go all the way. So this is the form. It's tilted. It contains interesting checkboxes, you know, because we're playing with the theme and personality of the cat, right? It also contains a lot of tilting, which happens, like, for example, for light boxes and things like that, right? And you will find it pretty much consistently used everywhere, navigation including, and, you know, and so on and so forth. And then the front page has become this, right? This. And there were a couple of things that we learned along the way while designing it, and it was a very long process. One of the things that I was using a lot is slow motion. I would record users while we were doing user interviews, and also myself, just by going through the site and looking very carefully into what is actually happening in there. So, for example, like this would be me, right, clicking all the way, because there was a 1 pixel shift somewhere happening, and I couldn't understand why. It was so annoying, and then I would do it like 100 times until I hit that thing when there is an offset, and I would finally fix it. So I have tons of videos like this. I don't know if you can see it, but there's a track at the bottom, and I would actually go and check if there is any noise somewhere, or if there is something like wrong, or the transition isn't right, or the tilting isn't correct, and things like that. And it helps a lot because, of course, it's a dynamic application. We built it all on top of Preact, which I will talk about later, but it meant that there might be some jumping here and forth. So going back and forth was very, very helpful. And it kind of required a focus, right? But I was lost most of the time, to be honest. Now imagine you wake up and you encounter in your new site, the prices are a bit off, a little bit off. And you're like, huh, that's interesting, let's fix it. And what do you do first? Right, cats. Right? Because, you know, we have the cat illustrator, and so we think, oh, well, let's create a cat who can cook, or a cat who can play guitar, or something like that, right? Many cats, right? And also then you see, oh, okay, in the checkout, there is something wrong here. I mean, the contrast is it's not that great, but there is something very wrong. And I would stare at the screen for like, I don't know, hours, until I find it, and I know what it is. I'm sure you can see it too. It's this. This is not properly aligned. 7 and the 9, no. This is not acceptable, right? We cannot live with this, right? So we had to find, like, introduce a soft hyphen, because otherwise it would be perceived as the hyphen, the and dash, sorry, and the 7 as one thing, and this is why it's not properly small caps, if you like. So I hope you appreciate the difference between this and this. Okay, maybe not. That's not so important. Another thing that was also important is to look into the print style sheets, not because we love print style sheets, but because we were too lazy to figure out a PDF solution to generate our invoices. So I spent a lot of time writing very dirty CSS to produce pretty decent invoices, right? Because otherwise we would need to spend a lot of time customizing and building our own thing. And while on it, I felt like, you know, if we're on print style sheet, let's create a good one for the article as well. So for the article, the idea was maybe we could just turn articles into PDFs, into ebooks, just by printing. So you could just take it with you or print out or save as PDF and you're done. And so we actually used CSS Grid layout in order to produce this, as you will see in a second, to produce this layout. So you can just take it with you, and it's like a book, it's like a mini book. It contains a table of contents and everything generated automatically, which I think is pretty cool, right? And so I would spend too much time on this instead of actually fixing bugs. And then, of course, you set up a new page, like a new GitHub, new issue, or open up a new branch, and then you start talking about what you're going to do. And so today I want to fix conference pages and stuff. And the first thing you do is more cat illustrations. Adding new cat illustrations, horizontal lines for meow content. And actually, we did have meow content. You might be smiling now. We actually were thinking at some point, after Sarah left, I must admit, after Sarah's left, I was thinking maybe it would be nice to integrate the catness in the code as well. As it turned out, after my short research, there are too many cat illustrations, or cat emoji, and they also look very different, so debugging is kind of hard. But you could do that, potentially. One thing we definitely do want to do is this. But I don't know. I would highly encourage you to do that too. All right? Now, the design part is one thing, but it was also important to look into the front-end side of things, right? And so, of course, what do you do when you start working on the front end? Well, you look into browser support. So it was like December 2015 when we actually started working on it. And I mean, we're in a comfortable place. We have people like you, and not like, you know who, people like you who have decent browsers. So we didn't have to worry too much about browser support, right? So that was pretty nice. That was pretty cool. But of course, there was also the other one. Right? So this is what, blood pressure goes up. I can almost sense it, right? That was pretty okay. Not a big problem there. Except that's not quite true, because there is one person coming to Smashing once every 2 years with the user agent being Internet Explorer 666. which is kind of mean because I have a graph, a chart, and then there is a spike with one person using IE666. That's very sad and very annoying. But I appreciate the joke there. That's kind of cool. Now, when we started working, it was kind of important to not look into using big frameworks. Obviously, we did not want to use jQuery. We did not want to use like Angular or anything of that kind. The smaller, the better. And so we actually kind of decided not to use anything in the beginning at all, which was a bad idea because we had to use something after all. But definitely not jQuery. And I just asked around a while back, they'll use jQuery in production, and actually many people don't do it anymore. It's not like I hate jQuery, it served its purpose, I just don't think we need it these days. Very much like I don't think that in many projects we need Modernizer these days. And so we kind of looked into small libraries because this is how we feel when using small libraries, and this is how we feel when we use large frameworks. There are too many unknowns, so you don't know what to do, right? And so first the thought would be to use React, and then we actually moved to Preact. And that was a very difficult decision, actually, because up until this point, still, we have to write a lot of stuff, custom stuff for Preact. So we kind of wished we started with React, to be honest. But it also was a licensing thing, so you know the story, right? But yeah, I will get to it in a second. Another thing that was important to me was to try to reduce the number of media queries as much as I could. And it's not because I hate media queries, and you might be wondering, what the hell did media queries do now? Why not media queries, right? Well, because it's always a maintenance issue for me. Because there is always, like Mike Riedmuller said once, there's always like these two states, and you have to interpolate between these two states, right? So you're designing maybe something tablet-ish and something desktop-ish, and then in between you have to converge, right? And this is the thing where, when we have to add a breakpoint because things start breaking. And then the more you want to define things, the more breakpoints you have to add. So if we look at your site, or any website really, we'll find out there are some things that are right, like for example in this area, right? So for mobile, everything is fine. For desktop, everything is fine. But here things start shifting, navigation is a bit off, text is a bit off, maybe the typography is a bit off. So, it's a bit weird. So, and then you add a breakpoint, and then you have to, add more and more media queries over time. And so for the layout, which was this, Sarah was building a lot of stuff using calc and also using pretty much just simple, how would I put it best? Well, mostly just using calc in order to bring things apart. But more specifically, what I want to show is what I decided to do then later when we actually started working on top of what Sarah was working on. If you're thinking about a component and you want to make it really fluid, right? You can think about its behavior defined as a function. Now, how many of you like mathematics? Who doesn't like mathematics? Okay, there's a lot of math coming in. I'm sorry. But it's not going to take too long. So what I was thinking is it would be nice to be able to define a function, a behavior function of a component, and then you would plug it in anywhere on the page, and it would just scale up and down beautifully without you having to plug in media queries. Now, when we define a behavior, right, it's usually not a linear growth. Think about like a component scaling up and scaling down. And we want to start growing somewhere and want to stop growing somewhere too, right? Think about typography, the H1. You don't want it to be too small. You don't want it to be too large, right? So if you want to define a behavior of a component, you could put the viewport, for example, at the bottom, right? And you could put the size of a component on the left, and then it would create some sort of function, right? Now, usually it's not a linear function, right? It will look more like this. Now, if you wanted to solve it with CSS, you will need to solve this, right? Which you can't do with CSS, right? You can approach it somehow, like you can break it down into lines and then go into interpolation and things like that. And more specifically, solving this. That would be a bit complicated, I think, for CSS purposes. But we thought maybe we could use something simpler and similar. Because this is what you want to achieve, right? Everything just scaling beautifully up and down without you having to add media queries, right? So Mike Riedmuller came up with this formula, which some of you might have seen before. But the idea is you have a minimum font size, right? And then you define the function that defines its growth between two viewports, and you kind of define the limits of that growth. So here you have the minimum font size being 16 pixels. Here the difference between maximum and minimum. And this is the area over which you're growing. And this is the difference between the minimum viewport and the maximum viewport, right? It can also be 0, well, 1,600 pixels to 0, right? So I was thinking maybe we could apply it everywhere. Like everywhere, go all the way, right? Creating some sort of experiences like this, right? Where you don't have to use media queries at all. It just naturally works according to the formula that you've built in, which of course would mean that you would have tons of magic numbers here and there, which are just experimental numbers. But I felt like maybe that would help, right? Or maybe it would be interesting to explore how it would work, right? So just, of course, because it's an arithmetic equation, it will require some calc, right? And calc is well supported except you know who, but we're used to it at this point. Pixels are fine too, for you know who, right? And then you could apply it not only to font size, but literally to everything. I mean, we applied it to padding, we applied it to margins, we applied it to offset for left and right, and line height, and everything. So this is the line height kind of done automatically, but of course it's not controlled. It's like it goes all the way up and it goes all the way down. So you want a nice controlled growth in line height. You want a smaller line height on smaller screens, a bigger, larger line height on larger screens, right? So it's kind of, you want to grow from 1.3 to 1.5 between 21M and 35M. All right, that's not that hard. So you just plug it in that same formula, have the minimum, the difference between them, the 100 VW minus where you start, and the difference between the viewport width, right? 35 minus 21, and you're done. No media queries required at all, right? You could, of course, use media queries, but you don't have to, right? And so Mike, again, came up with this idea of what if the layout would operate the same way, where everything just automatically and naturally grows and shrinks. Or you can kind of turn fluid behavior off or on. I know you can't see it. Maybe if we can turn off the lights, that would be better. But you could set the calc equation on the font size on the body. I know it sounds scary. That's okay, right? On the body, and then everything down the line would be defined using M units or REM units, right? Then everything would scale just like magic, right? In the same way, if you want to do it the other way around, where you have kind of a fixed environment, and, fixed at, let's say, oh, this is what it would look like, sorry. Where you have a fixed place, like fixed at, for example, inside of a totally fluid environment. But you can also do it the other way around, which we ended up using, where you set the body font size on 100%, as we all do, I guess, right? And then you create a fluid container at the bottom, which is defined with font size using calc, and everything else is defined using REM units or M units, right? So that would give you this kind of experience, where something is growing naturally without media queries at all, and then everything else becomes more or less fixed, right? And so this is kind of the tweak that we introduced later, where this layout is growing now mostly like using calc on everything, on padding, on font size, even on border radius sometimes, on pretty much everything. And of course, if people resize, you might see every now and again on a low power device, you might see some slowness. But because most people don't do this, except you, of course, that's okay. Right? So we would have a lot of stuff like this with a lot of magic numbers which define the behavior of those components now. And in many cases, no media queries are required. Right? That was interesting. I mean, we ended up not using it everywhere, but in a good number of places. Right? Another thing that was also interesting is to look into what we can do with HTTP2, and specifically for performance. And we moved to HTTP2 2.5 years ago, so it wasn't really a big deal of moving to HTTP2, but we wanted to make most use of HTTP2. Now, what we found out quite quickly is that we had to figure out what would be a nice way for deployment. That's a lot of text, it's not so important anyway. But we had to figure out how would we load JavaScript and how would we load CSS. So let me just jump a little bit in here. And, in HTTP2, of course, you can have tons of HTTP requests, right? And it doesn't matter as much as in HTTP1. So we thought maybe, because everything is compartmentalized anyway, every single CSS file and every single JavaScript file that we have could just become one of the many JavaScripts and CSS that we're going to just plug in. And we don't have to bundle everything, and we will make use of parallelism when loading all the stuff. Turned out to be a very, very bad idea. Very bad idea. Because packaging is still very important because of gzip, right? Because packaging matters because there are issues with sending too many small JavaScript files or too many CSS files to the browser. First, the compression of a large package could benefit from dictionary reuse. And second, browsers are just not optimized for this kind of treatment, right? So in the end, what worked best was to use packaging for things like everything related to header, everything related to footer, everything related to comments, everything related to search, and have maybe like 10 to 12 different packages that we would be then using, right? Goes for CSS and goes for JavaScript as well. And one thing that was particularly interesting is how we would load then CSS, right? And where would we put it? And you know, many of you will have heard, of course, of critical CSS and above default CSS and things like that. And you know, in the past, we used to have just link attribute with we would combine all of the CSS and minify it. And then we would move to something like this with some tricks. We would load some critical CSS first and then full CSS later. And then it seemed, at least in the beginning, that in HTTP2, the best way to load CSS would be to break it down into 5 to 10 packages and you know, load it like this, right? But it turned out, at least in our test, that the best way to do it would be to actually load CSS that you need just before you need it, right? So right before header, right before main, right before comments, right before footer, right? And there was an article by Jake that came actually February, I think, this year, last year actually, when he used exactly the same thing with progressive CSS. Now, it's kind of the same page, the one loaded with progressive, where you have, again, the CSS files kind of split throughout the page, and the other one just without. Obviously, CSS is blocking rendering, so no wonder that it's kind of slower compared to the previous one, right? Another thing that was also interesting is to look into what we're going to deal with web fonts. Now, Frank said it very nicely. Web fonts, just link and done. Well, not quite. Has become a bit more complicated. And one of the critical things that we kind of looked into in the beginning, because fonts, we have 2 typefaces, and we're using regular and bold and italic, so it makes up 6 typefaces, like 6 font files. And they are already subset, but they're still pretty huge. So we had to figure out a way to do it, and one of the ways would be to have a 2-stage render where you render a Roman first, and then everything else later, right? But that felt a bit too complicated, so I thought maybe let's make it a bit more complicated. So I came up with a new thing called CFOFTWDUASW. Right? Feel free to tweet about it if you want to. So basically the idea is we put that file, the font files, in a service worker, right? And so whenever we need it, we're actually going to fetch it from service worker. On the first visit, you're going to get the fonts, the content in the fallback font right away. And then, of course, we'll load web fonts asynchronously. We'll put them in the service worker. And then on the next visit, we're testing if they are in the service worker already. And if they are not, then we're going to do the same thing again. And if they are, we're going to fetch them from a service worker and apply before the content starts render. And it causes like 20, 30 milliseconds delay, but that's OK, right? Feel free to use it. It's not a big deal, I know. But it took a lot of time to actually develop it and build it. It was not that easy, right? And of course, using WoW2 as a standard. You know who doesn't support it, right? So, however, it was also kind of interesting and important to look into what we're going to do as a fallback because we wanted to provide a nice experience, right? So we would have stacks like this. We would not just have, Elena sans serif or so, but actually go all the way and targeting specifically platforms, different platforms. So iOS, Android, Microsoft, and then the natural fallback. And if you look into it, there are many platforms. So you can actually support quite a lot. So we ended up with verbose stacks that looked like this, where we're targeting iOS, macOS San Francisco, Android, Microsoft KDE, Ubuntu, GNOME, and fallback, right? So it kind of covers all the bases, so we don't have to worry about anything, right? That was pretty cool, and it was not that difficult, right? Now, the one significant thing, though, that I do have to kind of come back now to is, of course, the backend stuff that we changed. That was also a big journey. I mean, I know it's packed, and I'm not going to take more than 10 minutes of your time. But that's been very, very important because we ended up having remarkable results. And I mean, we haven't really optimized the site yet, like properly optimized. But if you look into the start render time with critical CSS, we get sometimes to 0.4, 0.5 seconds for start render. And don't get me wrong, it's a single page application whether we want it or not, right? So that's quite remarkable. And again, if you look into it, nothing is cached. Like, almost nothing is cached. So the only thing that we're using is service workers there. And they are really helping. But I can talk about it a bit later. But one thing that was important there is to figure out what we're going to do with the backend. And as some of you might have known already, we moved away from LAMP stack to Jamstack, moving away from WordPress to Netlify CMS. And I didn't believe it at first that we can actually pull it off, but it looked like we could. So kind of going kind of serverless, if you like. And yes, we moved away from WordPress, but not because I hate WordPress or we didn't find it comfortable. It just felt like we don't really need it now, in a way. We can pull off like having like a static site generator, pre-building the entire thing, and then pushing it to CDN and serving everything from a CDN. We're not a big fancy website, right? It's not that complicated. So we got to work, and initially we were thinking about maybe using Jekyll or GitHub, but in the end we decided to do something else. Now this Jamstack is basically JavaScript APIs and markup, and the idea is this. We have tons of different stuff on the side. We have job postings, we have membership profiles, we have shop accounts and all of this stuff. So all of these things, comments and so on, all of these things are markdown files now. So all those markdown files are pushed through a build tool. It generates all the markup and everything that we need. Then we pull CSS in, and then we pull JavaScript in, and then we're kind of pushing it to a CDN, and we serve content from a CDN, straight from a CDN, no database required at all. So no error establishing a database connection anymore, I think. I hope, at least, right? And there is a good reason for it. Now, how many of you are actually still using, or you don't see it, or maybe you do. How many of you are using FTP for deployment? That's okay. It's a safe place. Anybody? Okay, that's fine. That's all right. Yes, good for you, FTP people. All right. But it's really interesting to see that we kind of are moving away maybe to Git just since 2010, 9 or so. And like GitHub is like everything now, right? The same with preprocessors and builders and things like that. It's just started recently. It was like 3-4 years ago, and now it's like gulp and grunt and everywhere. You will not get a job if you don't know what gulp and grunt is, right? The same for APIs. Like we have tons of APIs that we can use as well. And it has to deal with how we used to use the web, right? In the beginning, you have a browser and a server, and you serve a static page, and you're happy and you're done, and that's it. And then somebody said, no, that's not good enough. We need to have an interactive clock. An interactive clock is very important. For that purpose, we need to have a program running. So we're going to have CGI bin and this kind of stuff. So that was okay. And then somebody said, no, it's not good enough. We need to have a database and proper structure and everything, which we're going to serve stuff from. And so we have a database now, wonderful, and we have PHP and MySQL, and it's great. Then somebody said, no, that's not good enough. We need to have caching, right? Caching is important. It's great for performance. So yeah, we're going to use caching. And then somebody said, no. We need to use a proper CDN. And then things get complicated, right? So we thought maybe we could actually get away from this to what's really something as simple as browser and CDN, right? And nothing else, more or less. So you can serve content straight from a CDN. So that means that when the user requests a page, right, basically, again, these markdown files are generating, through the build tool, they're generating all the stuff, the markup and the HTML that we need. We push it to a CDN. We use some APIs for interactive elements like search and comments and things like that. Mostly like custom APIs that we have built on our own with Netlify. And we serve it. And that's it, right? And it felt just natural to kind of build this. It was a single-page application, but more specifically, it was kind of a set of a bundle of single-page applications, because I did not want to have a failure, like the single point of failure. So it's like a tons of APIs that communicate with each other. Because, for example, membership, you can be accessing conferences page or shop page or something else while being logged in, right? So it had to be everywhere. And so this was the architecture. It's very simple, actually, in a way. And so yeah, I don't think I have to say. Like, it's basically all based on microservices, right? And this API, this was kind of the breaking point. That was an important thing for us. When we started working on it, those APIs that we would build, they had to become open source, right? So Netlify released and open sourced all of the APIs that we built along the way, right? The CMS one, the one for commons, the one for authentication, the one for commerce, for memberships, and things like that. So I'm very, very happy about that, right? Kind of moving, not using React and using Preact instead. And it all had to be progressively enhanced, right? That's the most important point for me. Because even if you don't have JavaScript, right, you still had to be able to do most of the stuff, especially reading articles. So for live search, we said, because we're of course using an API to make it work, for live search we said, okay, if JavaScript is not available, Okay, so by default, it's Google search. You click on a button, you go on Google, you can find whatever you're looking for there, right? And if you have JavaScript, then it's our fancy live search, right? For commons caching, for network, and all the stuff for performance, it's service workers. It's been wonderful. It's magic. For legacy browsers, we wanted to have a nice, accessible experience. You should be able to read all articles. That was the critical thing. For PDFs and all kind of fancy things, print style shit. For checkout, it's been very, very hard to make it work without JavaScript. And it doesn't work without JavaScript right now. We still have to look into it. And then also on the strategic side, for responsive images, we're using Cloudinary. We looked into server push. We looked into different ways of serving critical CSS. It's been a bit more difficult than I was expecting, so we don't make any good results there. And yeah, for deployment, 10 CSS JavaScript bundles. And yeah, we used to use WordPress. It was nice and fancy and lovely, and you can have tons of plugins. And this is Netlify CMS. It's of course not the WordPress level, like by any means, but it's okay for us. It's enough. We have all the things that we need. If we need to select, let's say, add a new author for our conferences, and we need to add a new job profile or something, we can all do it. That's not a big deal. So it all works. Now, it's still a lot of work to be done there, of course, but I'm just really happy with the results in terms of performance, right? Now, to wrap up, we still have some things to do, obviously. We still have the running beta, open beta, and we hope that we're going to launch later this month. It's actually now staging. It's like the second beta or so. It's staging.smashmagazine.com, but we'll be launching soon anyway. And we still have some stuff to do. But yeah, I think we need to tweak performance and clean up things, and migration is going to be difficult. But let me wrap up. I know I overran already. So that was a really long journey, and I'm really happy that it's going to finish soon. You have no idea. First, I can't see cats anymore. I just can't see cats anymore. That's one thing. The other thing is, it's been like a lot of CSS hackering, especially the print style shit. That was a lot of work. But also other things were just madness. We did decide to use Preact. That was probably a bad decision, to be honest, if I'm being very, very honest, because we had to rebuild and rewrite a lot of stuff on our own, and again, specifically for Preact. It was also very, very hard to keep everything accessible. Starting from all the buttons and all the switches and everything. And so we worked with Hayden on accessibility. There are still some parts in checkout which requires some work, so we're still on it, right? Overall, I'm just really, really happy in terms of performance, because I was not expecting that kind of boost. And service workers are like magic, so please use service workers. It should be like the rule. Every single designer should use a service worker, like always. But whatever we did, and it took a lot of time to build it, it always felt like something is missing. So this always felt like this, and I want to leave you with this, because this is literally a story of my life for the last 1.5 years. And it's been a bit sad at times, because you never get things done properly and right, and just right. So this is my slide number 369, and this is what I want to leave you with. Can we turn on the music as well? For designers. That's just sad, right? But we have cats, many, many, many cats. So with this in mind, please break things, because we have time to repair them later. And please find that little signature that will define who you are, and use it consistently everywhere, even if it means 68 freaking cats. So with this in mind, meow, and thank you for being here.